The Game Boy is the second best-selling handheld console of all time, beaten only by its younger brother, the DS, and sitting right above its next-gen successor, the Game Boy Advance. I think it's safe to say that for over 30 years now, Nintendo's had a stranglehold on the handheld market, and I'd go as far as to say that they pretty much are the handheld market. The original Game Boy dominated for almost 10 years, right up until the release of the Game Boy Color, and with it came a huge library of great games. Being a kid in the 90s, I spent many a car ride playing my admittedly small selection of games that I had for it. But out of them, there were a few that I played more than any others. Ones that I shudder to think of the amount of playtime I actually have logged in them. Let's talk about them. So I forget how or why, but one day, my mom promised me she'd buy me a Game Boy. I think she bribed me somehow, but nevertheless, I was promised a Game Boy, and shortly after, I received a brand new see-through Game Boy, which I still have to this day. With it came a copy of Super Mario Land, the first ever handheld Mario platformer, and I was very confused. It was very reminiscent of the NES Mario games I'd played, but somehow totally different. It took some getting used to, but I learned to love Super Mario Land. It's incredibly different than the games that came before it, especially when compared to Super Mario Bros. On the NES, which is probably the closest in comparison visually, I'd say. Also, I can't believe that I just said Super Mario Bros. I hate when people say that, but I wrote it that way in the script because that's how they write it, and I was reading off of the script and I said bros even though I don't say that. It's brothers. It's Super Mario Brothers, not Super Mario Bros. Bob. Anyway, imagine my confusion when I picked up what I thought was a fire flower only to fire something that bounced all over the goddamn place out of my hand, or when I jumped on what I thought was a Koopa only to have its shell explode in my face. Being developed by a totally different team than the console Mario releases, Super Mario Land was designed in what seems to be a bubble. It's as if someone tried to make a Mario game after hearing someone else describe to them what a Mario game was, but never actually playing one themselves. This isn't a bad thing though, because the team that did work on it was reputable. Is Gunpei Yokoi, dude knew what he was doing. So its deviation from typical Mario tropes in this context isn't a bad thing. Don't get me wrong, this game is super weird, but I think that's part of the charm. The music is also stupidly catchy, but then again, it was composed by Hip Tanaka, so that's really no surprise. It's also really short. Like, you can beat it in about a half hour, but what's there is solid, and it's definitely worth the playthrough considering it takes pretty much no commitment. There aren't many worlds or stages, but it's just a nice, straightforward platforming game. It also mixes it up a couple times and lets you pilot a submarine and a plane to fight bosses in a full-on side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. Normally I'd hate this, but it works well and is pretty unintrusive. Not that I hate shoot-'em-ups, but I just don't like when they deviate from the main gameplay style to do something that has nothing to do with the game. Super Mario Land was the first of its kind, and it definitely shows. The controls take some getting used to, especially if you're used to modern side-scrolling Mario, but the team behind this game decided to take the Mario IP and do their own spin on it when they could have just played it safe and made some watered-down version of the console games. I think that's why, despite its flaws, it's still a really memorable game. Okay, my cousins used to have this Tiny Toons game for the Sega Genesis, and every time I went to their house, I loved to play it. I was pretty jealous because I always wanted my own copy, and I have absolutely no idea at what point this happened, but eventually I got Tiny Toons Bab's Big Break for the Game Boy. I still didn't have the Genesis game, but this was at least a good enough alternative to keep me satisfied. Still wanted the Genesis one, though. There's a ton of Tiny Toon Adventures games that I'd like to talk about at a later date, but this is the first one I ever owned myself. The premise of the game's pretty simple, but with 90s cartoon platformers, that's pretty much all it needs to be. So Babs Bunny wants to leave Acme University to become an actress, and her friends, Buster, Plucky, and Hampton, think it's dangerous for her to go off on her own, so they decide to follow her to make sure she's safe. What follows is a platformer very typical for how a lot of the Tiny Toons platformers work, in where it's a game that you can swap characters on the fly, all with slightly different abilities. And by abilities, I mean it really just changes the type of ammo you can use as a projectile. Buster throws a carrot in an arc akin to the axe from Castlevania, Plucky throws a pineapple that acts very similar to the Super Ball in Mario Land, and Hampton goes bowling. It's really a standard 2D platformer. Navigate through each level, collecting gems and attacking enemies by either jumping on their heads or lobbing fruit at them. At the end of each world, there's a boss, and they're actually pretty fun and surprisingly require a bit of pattern memorization. Every once in a while, you get the option to switch to a different character outside of the initial three, but it's a big fat lie because all this does is basically just start up a cutscene that shows that new character helping us progress. but you never actually get to play as them. This used to bother me so much when I was little. I want to play as Dizzy Devil, and instead I gotta just watch him. I played this game religiously, but sadly I never actually beat it, which I don't think is really my fault because I just recently found out the Japanese version of this game has unlimited continues and a password system. Why do we always get screwed? So I have a little story for you. It's 1998 and the Game Boy camera had just recently come out. I remember talking to a couple friends at school about it, and I said something along the lines of, "Man, I wish I had one." To which a classmate then replied by telling me he had an extra he could give me. I didn't really believe him, but on the off chance that he wasn't a big fat liar, I could maybe have a Game Boy camera in my future, so I accepted his offer. A couple days went by, I asked him about it, he said he forgot to bring it. A week goes by, same story. Another week or so later, and I asked him again about it, because either he was gonna own up to being a liar pants on fire, or I was getting a Game Boy camera. Well, he finally shows up at school and hands me a copy of Yoshi. He told me he couldn't find his extra Game Boy camera, but he gave me his copy of Yoshi since he made a promise he didn't keep. I knew he was full of shit, but now, still to this day, I have a copy of Yoshi on the Game Boy because some kid at school was a fucking liar. Anyway, I ended up really loving the game. For any of you who haven't played it, it's a puzzle game, and it also has a version on the NES as well. You play as Mario, and you have to match the falling puzzle pieces, in this game, Mario enemies, just like you do in, like, 8,000 other puzzle games. You do this by swapping stacks of pieces to make incoming blocks fall on the right tower, oftentimes having to do multiple swaps to line everything up correctly. Occasionally, a Yoshi egg will fall in two separate pieces, a bottom and a top. The idea is to sandwich the pieces in between the two pieces of the shell. Doing so clears out all the enemies in between, awards you points, and adds a number to the Yoshi counter, which then adds to your score. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's definitely a solid and fun puzzle game, which, in my opinion, sits right up there with Tetris or Puyo Puyo. Similar to my situation with the Tiny Toons game, I had yet another cousin that had Kirby Superstar on the SNES, which I myself did not own, and subsequently acquired a Game Boy game from the same series. Still to this day, I love Kirby Superstar, but Kirby's Dream Land was the first Kirby game I ever owned. I'm not really sure what I can say about this game that hasn't already been said, but well, here we go. Kirby's Dream Land was the first Kirby game ever released, and because of this, he didn't yet have his signature copy ability, or even a canonical skin color. This is one of the easiest platformers I've ever played, and maybe one of the easiest of all time, but it's also super fucking fun. Kirby's Dream Land is extremely short, about as short as Super Mario Land, but it's a fun time all the way through with no padding. Since you don't have the copy ability, your only means of self-defense is either sucking in air and using it as a short projectile to damage enemies, or cutting out the middleman and sucking up the enemies directly and spitting them back out at each other. This is totally different from the rest of the series because in all the other games, you only use those basic abilities when you don't have a copy power-up, which does not happen often. So unlike the other Kirby games, you can't rely on copy abilities. So the gameplay in this one feels a bit different in how you approach each level. But obviously the game was built around this, so it doesn't seem bothersome. It is, however, a little weird and jarring going from modern Kirby mechanics to this, especially when a lot of the enemies you've learned carry certain abilities you can steal still exist in this game, but just kind of do nothing now. This is the one game that I knew every single time I slapped it in my Game Boy, I was gonna beat it. And this was a good feeling considering I barely was able to beat any games when I was a kid. I'd just play stuff till it got too hard or till I got a game over. But I think Kirby's Dream Land was the first game I ever actually beat. And to be honest, the way the franchise is marketed, that was probably exactly what they were trying to accomplish. Despite how easy it is, this game is still fun to go back and play, and to this day, it's still one of my favorite Kirby games. It's just a short, solid, friendly, safe, and wholesome good time. It's basically Kraft macaroni and cheese or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Or grilled cheese. Good and fulfilling on its own, and then they dipped that grilled cheese in tomato soup and made Kirby's Adventure on the NES. For some reason, a common theme here involves my cousins, but it was Christmas of 1999, and I was over at my cousin's house where I received Pokemon Blue as a gift from my aunt. And knowing nothing about what it was, upon first starting it up, my first thought was, oh, this is like Dragon Warrior. Now, Dragon Warrior, or Dragon Quest everywhere else except the US at the time, was the first RPG I ever played. I really liked the music and the visuals, but trying to play an RPG like that when you're like 8 years old is a nightmare. Despite this, I often found myself booting it up, playing for like an hour, never getting anywhere, and then shutting it off. Pokemon was the first time I ever made progress in and then subsequently beat an RPG. And by beat, I mean I played for so many hours upon hours that I can't believe my first Game Boy is still functional. Actually, this one day, after I had been playing for over a year, my save file corrupted. I still have no idea how, but I got so mad about it that instead of feeling defeated, I channeled that rage into doing nothing but playing Pokemon Pokemon Blue all day until I re-beat it, and then told the game to eat shit by using a Game Shark and getting every Pokemon to complete my Pokedex because I felt like I earned that right. I may have lost my original team, but I quickly took my Pokemon Master title back. Eventually, I made some friends who also played the game, and there was no going back. Between the enormous popularity, the made-up glitches and fake game information about new or hidden Pokemon, the real glitches that only further added legitimacy to any made-up bullshit people posted online, the news coverage, I didn't stand a chance. It was all anyone I knew was talking about or doing, and I was totally on board with it. Now, I won't go on to give you some Gen 1er garbage. Gen 1 is great, and it's definitely one of my favorite games in the franchise, but I won't be deluded into thinking Gen 2 didn't improve on and expand literally every facet of the groundwork set by Gen 1. With the release of both the GBA remakes and Pokemon Let's Go, though, it's easy to say Red and Blue still hold up, at least at their core. Not original Red and Green, though. We don't talk about those. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to keep up to date with new videos I put out, click that subscribe button and also the bell icon, because apparently you need to do that now. And if you want to help me not have digestive problems by living off top ramen, my Patreon link is right there too.